part of the danger of warning the public about Russian disinformation is that people become paranoid. And does that actually help the Russian government do what it's trying to do? So I think that the authoritarian leaders see Trump as a kindred spirit, and he sees the same in them. And yes, I certainly think that there is an unofficial authoritarian alliance that is continuing to expand to the present day. Turkey is supposed to be a U.S. ally, and here they are acting much more like how Russia, or for that matter, the Soviet Union, had intermixed their cultural institutions. For example, ballerinas as spies for the purposes of state espionage.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I chat with author Chad L. Lewis, who wrote the book The Persuasion Game, which looks at how foreign influence operations and Kremlin-backed disinformation exploit Western politics. We explore how these narratives spread through shadow diplomacy, digital propaganda, and authoritarian networks, and how they have reshaped public trust and democracy in the 21st century. I hope you find this episode interesting. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Chad, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Chris, good. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the chance to have a chance to talk about the book.
Excellent. Well, pleasure to have you on. So for the benefit of listeners, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and then what initially drew you to study sort of post-Soviet Russian politics and US foreign policy?
I was born in the United States and raised in the United States, lived there up until graduating high school. And decided to graduate high school and go backpacking, saving up money to do so. Went backpacking for, 6.5 months through Europe by myself, which is a wonderful experience for a 19, 20-year-old guy to kind of really open up and see the world and understand that the world that you grew up in is actually tiny compared to the world that is out there. So I guess after backpacking, it kind of made me yearn to explore the world more and understand it more. And thus, I studied history and added on a second degree of political science in university. And I think due to the fact that I grew up with Tom Clancy novels and the Soviet threat of the 1980s, my interests leaned, of course, towards Russia and understanding how Russia is interacting, or I should say the Soviet Union at that time was interacting with the United States and why. So I graduated with degrees in history and political science that focused primarily on Russia, Europe, American foreign policy, and national security issues. And then after university, I wanted to teach abroad for a number of years just to kind of get a deeper understanding of those countries that I go to. And I taught abroad in Prague and Barcelona for a year. And then I moved on to St. Petersburg, which was my ultimate target. And then I taught English there for 6 years. So one might say I kind of have a broad understanding of social psychology in Russia, as well as how the news works, and then add that to the background of understanding Russian history and Russian foreign policy and national security studies. I have a certain depth of knowledge when it comes to Russia.
What era were you in Russia? So this is the early 90s, is it?
No, this would be 2007 to to the end of 2012. Actually, it's kind of formative years for the current Russian government.
Well, yeah, such an interesting time to be in Russia. Can you just paint us a little bit of a picture of what it was like sort of living and teaching there, especially as an American?
Yeah, so like as an American being there, you feel the hostility that was there from the Soviet times. I.e., I heard more than a few times from older Russian women, Yankee go home on the street, or they give you a dirty look as an American or as a foreigner because you stick out the way you dress as compared to Most Russian guys, at least in St. Petersburg, I would stick out. And you could feel how Russian-American relations were going by how often you would get stopped getting off the metro. So um, you live in London, so you get off the metro. I don't suspect you would worry about the police consistently stopping you as you come off the metro and asking for your documents. And
No.
even worse, telling you your documents are false, or that there's some types of mistakes in them, blah, 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 and essentially asking for money. And with the threat of some type of police action that comes along with that. So those are kind of the real basic things. But like at the same time, you would see the youth of Russia, the ones that didn't grow up in Soviet times, and this is before a massive amount of Russian disinformation happened domestically in Russia. The youth of Russians, they didn't grow up in the Soviet time, so they didn't have the psychology of hating the United States. And so they were very, very open to how does the world work? How do you view the world? How does Russia fit into that world? And that was just a huge breath of fresh air, because otherwise you would feel the cold, steely hand of the Russian government in day-to-day activities, where you're, as I said, get off the metro and someone says your visa documents are incorrect, and you know they're correct. So you would feel that type of pressure. I would liken it to perhaps Berlin or Paris in the early 1930s, in that time period, where like you still saw like a liberal democratic ideal by a lot of Russian people. And the Russian government hadn't come down so hard yet, either on dissidents within Russia or on using disinformation on the Russian public. So collectively, you could feel like a sense of freedom, but you had the feeling of, the steely hand of government coming down slowly but surely on the Russian public, and that would include you in Russia. So I had a number of weird episodes in Russia that kind of highlight those experiences. If you want, I can tell you a quick one.
Yeah,
It's
go
an
for it, go for
interesting
it.
one.
Mm.
So I had met a Russian girl, when I lived in Barcelona, and she had lived in Cyprus. And when I was moving to St. Petersburg, she came with me and kind of set things up. So I was dating her, and then fast forward 6 months later, it was around Christmas, and she came came to St. Petersburg and wanted me to go with her to her hometown, which is near Ekaterinburg. And so that's a good 2.5 days of train travel from St. Petersburg, give or take. And on that metro train, or I'm sorry, on that train, we were in like a sleeping compartment with two bunk beds on each side, two and two. And on one side, it was she and I was on the top bunk. This was prior to my Russian skills being, well, much, much better. That would come in years. And I was sitting up there reading a book on, I think it was a Russian fiction book. And on the other side of the bunk beds, there was a retired policeman and a military veteran. And the retired policeman, the military veteran, were, of course, curious about me, being that I'm American. And they would ask a couple questions, and the Russian military officer, or a former military officer, I should say, he was sitting there drinking a bottle of vodka on the train. And I'm not fully understanding what's happening in the conversation. Again, I'm kind of in my book and letting it happen. But my girlfriend is entirely listening to the conversation, and the conversation gets increasingly violent in terms of the wording. And what it comes down to is that the retired military officer was frankly threatening to kill me and rape my girlfriend, and was
Jesus.
saying
Yeah.
it publicly in front of the retired policeman. The retired policeman's like, "Hey, you really should slow down both on the drinking, and what you're saying are
Mm.
things that don't appreciate in this room, blah, blah, blah." And his response was, "To hell with you. I'll kill you too, blah, blah, blah." So, this is this is 6 months into me being in Russia, so this is an experience of sorts, and it gets even crazier. So my girlfriend, understanding that there is actually a threat on the table to rape her and kill me, and potentially the retired policeman, she goes to the bathroom on the train. She goes to the bathroom, comes back, and 5 minutes after she comes back, a policeman comes in, and the policeman comes in, sees the bottle of vodka, and says, okay, you can't be drinking vodka or alcohol except in the dining car. So I'm going to take this bottle from you. And if I see you doing it again, then you'll be off the train. And uh, I am slightly oblivious to the situation. I know that the girlfriend left. I knew that there was language, but I know the language was soft in conversation. So I didn't connect the dots yet. And my girlfriend couldn't tell me, because to tell me would be to tell everybody that
Yeah,
what's going on. And so the policeman leaves with the bottle of vodka. The veteran pulls out another bottle of vodka and keeps on drinking. And like the retired policeman's like, whoa, you want to slow down here. You don't want to get kicked off the train. It's like uh, late December in the middle of nowhere in Russia. Like, it's cold. You don't want to be caught in this small town. And the guy's response is, I'll kill you. I'll kill the policeman. I'll do whatever I want, blah, blah, blah. And so my girlfriend, again, I'm not fully aware of what's going on. My girlfriend goes out of the compartment again to the bathroom, and comes back 5 minutes later. And then 5 minutes after that, the policeman shows up and says, oh, you have another bottle of vodka. This time you're off the train. And what is fascinating is the socio-psychological stuff that appears next, which is this military veteran was extremely aggressive to everyone around. But when the policeman comes, he becomes incredibly meek, like keeping his head down. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Blah, blah, blah. And the policeman has to inquire to me about, what am I doing here? What did I observe? Blah, blah, blah. My girlfriend explains, well, hey, his Russian's not very good, but I'll do translations for him. And the policeman says, well, I need him to sign this document saying that he witnessed XYZ. She looked it over, of course, and she says, okay, yeah, you can sign this. Don't worry. There's no problem for you. And so I signed the document, and the policeman turns to me and he asks me in a serious way, I have a question for you. And I was like, okay, sure. What do you think of Jean-Claude Van Damme? And, and I'm thinking to myself, like, where is all this coming from?
Yeah.
And he says to me, he says the question, and I say to him, good martial artist, bad actor. And he says to me, funny, I find the opposite is true. And then he headbutts the military veteran on the train with blood coming down. And this is, again, there's seconds between this happening. So I'm sitting here in shock that this just happened in front of me, because now we're seeing the authority of a police officer acting way above what he can do, as well as, the military veteran psychology of, the world has kind of screwed him over, and that now he feels he's able to do anything he wants. And then there's the American experience of, oh my God, what did I just witness? So I wanted to give you that, because it's the shock of going to Russia that is the real shock. It is not necessarily black and white as in good and bad, but black and white as in so different than everything you have ever known that it just strikes you immediately. And you can't really explain it to other people unless they had actually been there, meaning that they would have to be not just necessarily in Russia, but at least in an authoritarian government environment where they feel the hands of government on you. So it was an interesting experience, to say the least. But I had a number of those in Russia while I was there. I also had the security services raid my apartment at 2:00 in the morning on a Tuesday.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was kind of them.
I was an English teacher. So it
Yeah.
gives you, I'm telling you these stories again, because it helps you get into the psychology of the state and the psychology of Russian people. That on one side, you can have friendly young Russian people, and on the other side, you have a paranoid government structure that is willing to put pressure on people because they're trying to protect themselves from quote foreigners that may try to subvert the Russian government or the Russian people.
Yeah, wow. Out of interest, how old was that veteran? Do you have any ideas of what war, could it have been Chechnya or something that he had been in?
Yeah, I would venture to say it would be likely to be Chechnya. He was probably in his late 30s, maybe even early 40s. So that would fit the timeline at
Yeah,
best. But
yeah.
yeah, so those experiences, they aren't the only experiences I had, obviously, in Russia, but they were two like central experiences in being able to understand things. Like another point that I wanted to make out of that Jean-Claude Van Damme story is the use of authority, i.e., if you have authority or if you act like you have authority, then people will respect you more. So if you go and you act like a meek American when a policeman confronts you for saying that your visa documents are incorrect, then they know they can prey on you. If you come and say no, they're not, and they say, "Well, I'm going to take you to the police station," then you say, "Well, I'm going to call my embassy and CNN." Then they back off, and so you learn this being there, that if you act with authority, that you can sometimes protect yourself from authority.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. That's a very interesting observation. Not that I hope any Americans or British people are planning to go to Russia anytime soon, but yeah, that'd be a bad idea, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't. I wouldn't recommend anybody going for at least a decade. If I were to look at and describe what the Russian government is from my academic background, I would say it's closer to fascism than anything I've seen.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, indeed. It's yeah, I find the whole looking at Russia at the moment, it's just I'm amazed how still there are people both on the sort of left and the right who seem to love Russia for different reasons, and I find it truly fascinating.
Well, I think that's also part of Russia's disinformation stream. That over time they've been able to, on the conservative side, for example, of American politics, they point out, uh, or Russia points out in its disinformation that they are God-focused, God-fearing people, which is ironic because the Russian population as a whole is not religious. They are very much atheists from the Soviet times. So they sell a false load of goods through their disinformation, for example, to conservatives in the United States. And those conservatives say, hey, Putin is against abortion. He is pro uniting the church and the state. So are we. So we should like him. That's one example. Or the other side of it, you have liberals who might say, "Oh, well, it's not as bad as you really say it is. It can't be that bad because we're not living in like 1930s Germany, World War II." And I would say to them, until you're there, you don't know what it feels like. You don't know what it's like when you have, for example, in your case, MI5 coming into your door at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you did nothing to bring that situation on, and they go through your books and ask you questions. It's just such an extreme sort of thing that you would
Mm.
only find in the movies.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something one would hope you'd never experience because it's horrendous. Because anything can happen in that scenario. Anybody makes the wrong move, it could end in fatalities and things. So it's
Yeah,
yeah,
well, I mean, and I think we're running into this situation in the United States. The Trump administration is trying to limit the usage of habeas corpus for non-citizens in the United States, but that's a very, very small step away from taking it away from American citizens. In other words, for your audience, if you take away habeas corpus, you're taking away the right to confront an accuser in court.
yeah.
And you take that away, then the government can do anything it wants.
Yeah, yeah, and we've seen it's been interesting there. Sorry, diverging a little bit, but their tactical use of deportations and who they've been targeting early
Mhm.
to then they're targeting people who are perceived as criminals, etc. And it sort of seems to give a legitimacy to what they're doing, but they're slowly eroding all the rights, and then they can target anybody in the future. It's yeah,
Yeah, that's the really big worry, and it's the thing that I saw in Russia, where habeas corpus doesn't really mean much. The law itself is arbitrary. It's sometimes on the whims of the leader. And I'm now beginning to see that in the United States. I frankly, beginning is the wrong word. I now see that very vividly in the United States, and that becomes worrisome.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, going into the themes of your book, you did a fantastic book called The Persuasion Game, and you were ahead of the curve in identifying sort of Kremlin-linked troll activity back in 2014. So what were the sort of early warning signs that you saw that others missed?
Oh, probably. I think I was just at the right time, at the right place, with the necessary background in Russian history and Russian foreign policy, Russian social psychology. Plus, I had a deep understanding of Russian grammar mistakes from teaching English. So when you combine that, it kind of allowed me to have deeper insight. So, you know, I know that, for example, Russians have problems with prepositions and articles, a, an, and the, of, and from. They can make common mistakes in English. And so when I first saw Russian disinformation operations begin, which I guess would be in February, March of 2014, it was on the Moscow Times website, which is an expat website for all intents and purposes about Russian news. And the articles had commentary sections beneath the articles, and those commentary sections generally would get filled with expat comments, and they may be, for a given article, 6, 7, 8 comments total. And then in February, March of 2014, it was flooded with hundreds of avatars making comments. And the vast majority of them were pro-Russian and would use false analogies, either in history or in politics, to change the perspective of a person who may be reading the comments. And at first, I thought it was just, patriotic fervor by a few Russians, but this the scale of it was in the hundreds per article. So and that in one case, I remember talking to or commenting back and forth with one of the Russian commenters, and I knew he was Russian, and he acted as if he was Russian, but he would make mistakes, and I would call out uh, his mistakes in his comment, not the grammar, but his actual comment itself. And he'd be like, yeah, you're right. I was wrong about that, blah, blah, blah. And then like a day or two later, same guy making the same comment to somebody else.
Hmm.
And that's when it really, really hit on me. Wait a second. What I'm seeing is an industrial sized scale of disinformation of Russians acting with U.S. avatars with names like Joe from Wisconsin, making Russian grammar mistakes, talking about Russian foreign policy, Russian history, and
Mm.
Russian national security goals.
Mm.
This does not compute.
No, no.
So that was in March, April that I came to the conclusion this is an organized effort. And then there was, maybe another month of me thinking and talking amongst family and friends of what does this mean? Because I'm the only person that so far is talking about it. And there is, of course, the question of, well, maybe you're not seeing what you thought you saw, and maybe you're just a little bit on the crazy side. And I had to keep confronting that question to myself. I'm like, wait a minute. No, I'm definitely seeing what I'm seeing, and I'm definitely seeing the Russian grammar mistakes. So the question really isn't whether or not I'm seeing it. The question is, what is the purpose of it? And I looked at it as Russia is trying to seed the ground of a future battlefield,
Yeah.
i.e., they're trying to change what Americans or Europeans thought about the war in Ukraine in 2014, and maybe trying to seed future conflicts, because essentially what they were doing by creating this industrial sized scale of disinformation is that they were trying to actually change the anchors of reality for people.
Yeah.
I came to the conclusion that this is seeding future battlefields for all intents and purposes. And so I reached out to a congressman and set up a meeting to discuss. And I sat down with his aide and talked for, I don't know, about 2.5 hours, how the disinformation fits into how Russia is operating in Ukraine, what Russia's goals are in Ukraine, how the war first started, and how Russia is essentially declaring war on the West as a whole. And that this was also, for example, part of the Syrian civil war with Russia getting involved, and that Russia was intentionally trying to change Europe by bombing hospitals in schools in Syria and pushing those migrants to Europe, and then letting migrant fevers, if you will, take hold in European governments, which would destabilize them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I went and tried to give that warning, and they kind of said at the time, yeah, we're worried about ISIS doing things like this, blah blah blah. And I'm thinking to myself, I just told you that Russia is doing industrial-sized disinformation, and your response is, yeah, we're worried about ISIS. ISIS doesn't have the same resources.
No, indeed.
And they don't, and I would argue they don't have the same resolution to do disinformation at the scale that Russia was willing to do it on. So, so I tried to warn the U.S. government. I did my best to do so, thinking this whole thing is a national security threat that if people wake up to what is happening, then they won't be able to change people's anchors of reality, because people will be aware that Russian disinformation is happening. But the only way to do that is to take it all public. But it didn't succeed. And so, fast forward to late spring, early summer 2016, and I'm seeing huge boosts of Russian disinformation. The entire time from 2014 forward, I'm watching Russian disinformation, not just on the Moscow Times, but now on BBC, on CNN, on Fox News commentaries, on the Washington Post, Washington Times, all across the spectrum of politics, and probably not just in the United States. I know I was combating Russian trolls during Brexit, talking about Brexit. So this was continuing on from 2014 all the way into the 2016 US presidential election. And the US government had to have some awareness that it was happening, but just chose not to respond or didn't know how to respond. Part of the danger of warning the public about Russian disinformation is that people become paranoid. And does that actually help the Russian government do what it's trying to do?
Yeah.
So that's one problem to think about.
Yeah. I think also when it got wrapped up in the 2016 election cycle, it made a lot of people at the FBI nervous because suddenly it became politicized. And I think then the will to do something about it kind of, people went into safety mode and didn't really want to deal with it and thought they would just pass the buck.
I think that's certainly a part of it. I think also it's just like, how do you combat something that requires you to censor the First Amendment in the United States? So like that has been an issue that I have pondered for, I don't know, close to a decade at this point. Probably more than a decade now. Is how do you respond to this? And the answer is, it's not easy to respond in a democracy where free speech is guaranteed.
Yeah.
And that the government, due to lobbyists from Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, don't want to regulate this stuff through the social media channels. And you have in the United States, you have Republican politicians that said during the Trump years that to censor disinformation from Russia means that you're also censoring conservative influencers, which is ironic when you think about it, because it means that conservative influencers were saying exactly the same thing that Russians were, which is another interesting tidbit of pondering.
Well, yeah, and I see it quite often on YouTube, etc. Is a lot of channels that do regularly pump out misinformation do get amplified, whilst other channels that that don't pump out misinformation, should we say, knowingly, they don't seem to gain the same level of traction or support.
Yeah, I was going to just say I would be careful about using the word misinformation and qualify it as disinformation versus misinformation. Disinformation is the intention to falsely inform someone. Misinformation is when you are almost the recipient of disinformation, that you don't know it is disinformation at this point. You just may not know if it's real or true or false. But like, yes, there's the question of disinformation and the expansion of disinformation to extremist channels, both in the United States and other countries.
Yeah. Well, you saw a lot of it pumped through Alex Jones's Infowars, and through conspiracy theory sites. And I have a pet running theory that a lot of popular conspiracy theories that kind of took off in the early 2000s might well, if you really look into it, there might well be even a slight Kremlin connection to some of those conspiracy theories.
Wouldn't surprise me. It's something that Putin, as a former KGB officer, would have in his psychology as Russian president. How can I screw with the West? Because the psychology of Putin, who's a throwback to the Soviet era, is always, the West/America is the enemy of Russia. They will always be the enemy of Russia. We must always fight them. Certain nostalgia.
Yeah, and get us to fight ourselves, so then we're, yeah, an easier target, so to speak. So,
Yeah, yeah. I remember thinking back in those years because I was just, I guess, coming out of university. That, like, I'm seeing these terrorist actions throughout the world, but eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be state funded support for these terrorist actions so that they can hide their state foreign policy goals from the rest of the world. And, lo and behold, that's kind of what happened over time. And that would be the Syrian civil war.
yeah, indeed, and the connection to the Wagner group, and again, as we were saying about sort of disinformation efforts and things, it kind of, a lot of it was run by the Wagner group, who are supposedly a deniable force, and obviously have now, been sort of integrated into the Russian military as, I think, the Africa Corps now and things like that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Now it's officially part of the Russian military.
yeah. So it's very interesting kind of connections there.
Yeah, indeed. So in the springtime of 2016, I watched a increasing uptick of Russian disinformation that was clearly Russian. And I reached out again to the same congressman's office and said, I need to have another meeting. And they said, oh, yeah, we remember you reaching out a couple of years ago. Is this about the same thing? I said, yeah, it's about the same thing. Russian disinformation operations that are going on without any response. And I sat down with the congressman's aide again in January of 2017, just days before Trump came into office. So, and this time I brought like documented understanding of, how the Russian disinformation plays into the Syrian civil war, into Brexit, into the American public, what their goals of it is, or what the goals are, and how it's ceding the future ground. And basically, I tried to give them a snapshot of also how it grew from a small amount of news sources to expanding to getting to the extremes, and not just in one country, but in multiple countries all at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And did they take you seriously at that second visit?
I think they took me a lot more seriously than the first time, but I don't think they. I think the response was, "Yeah, but what do you want us to do?" And and my response, I guess I didn't really have a good way of answering that question other than, hey, you are the US government, or at least you're a representative of the US government. The US government should be responding to this. I don't know if it's Congress's job or the FBI's job or who I should be talking to, but I know somebody should be doing something.
Yeah.
But, weeks later, the Russian investigations were fully started. So I kind of feel happy about that.
Yeah. Well, good.
Yeah.
Well done. So let's take a break and be back with more. Hey everybody, it's Chris here. I hope you're well. Have you ever wanted to run one of your own podcasts? Well, on Monday, the 22nd of September, I'll be running a one-day workshop with my friend Jeff, who runs a Doctor Who podcast called Who Corner to Corner. And we'll be looking at the basics of podcasting and empowering you to make your own podcast. So join us on Monday, the 22nd of September. The link is in the show notes below. What moment did you realize then that that there was sort of a bigger story here, something connecting Giuliani, foreign billionaires, and U.S. political institutions?
If you remember, Donald Trump was impeached in 2019 for trying to extort the president of Ukraine to announce criminal investigations into Donald Trump's political opposition, which was Joe Biden.
Mm.
So I think you had that element that I knew about from 2019. And with the stories about Giuliani and his associate Lev Parnas doing things in Ukraine to try to push the Ukrainian government to announce criminal investigations of Joe Biden and his son, they was also information coming out of the news about Giuliani doing secret Venezuelan talks that were unsanctioned by the U.S. government. So I had those two things in the back of my head. And then come September 2020, an article comes out on NBC and through the OCCRP, which did a joint investigation with NBC about Lev Parnas's connections to Turkish lobbying in the United States. And I mentioned to my wife at the time, this is something I would love to kind of, peek a little bit further underneath the hood, uh, and see if there's something there, because this seems like it could be something. And the American public was going into the elections. Nobody's paying attention to something like this. And so I read the article, and essentially the article is connecting Lev Parnas to Turkish billionaires who sought to lobby the US government to drop a prosecution. So my wife and I kind of sat down and took a look at it maybe 2 or 3 days later. And uh, in a really, really short time, I connected Giuliani to also Turkish lobbying at the same time. So these actions seem to be running in parallel. Parnas is helping Turkish billionaires seek lobbyists in the United States. And Giuliani, he becomes the lawyer of a multi-billion-dollar money launderer, which we'll get a little bit further into. Uh, so what I was looking at in my head is, okay, on one side you have Giuliani doing secret talks in Venezuela, secret talks with Ukraine, and now there seems to be also potentially secret talks in Turkey. And if that's the case, then it looks like Giuliani may have been acting as a foreign agent for foreign governments. And at the time, Giuliani is the president's private lawyer. So the
Big
ramification,
conflict of interest, yeah.
the conflict of interest is astronomical. I mean, we're talking about criminal implications. We're talking about national security implications. We're talking about geopolitical implications for all this stuff. And then we're also wondering, or I'm wondering to myself, does Donald Trump realize, if I'm correct about all this stuff with Rudy Giuliani, does Donald Trump realize that Rudy Giuliani is doing these things? Because that also has ramifications too. That if that is true, and Trump is just acquiescing or maybe even helping Giuliani to move forth in helping his foreign clients in the United States, then Trump himself would be complicit in acting as a foreign agent, essentially acting with as a mercenary lobbyist, but not reporting that you are a lobbyist to the U.S. government. And let me clarify that for a second here. So there, in the United States, the Congress in the 1930s created a law called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA. And the purpose of it was that it was trying to combat Nazi and Soviet agents that were trying to subvert American interests in the United States. This was happening in the 1930s. And so the end result is that the creation of FARA, and essentially it requires people who are working for foreign governments to register everything they do in lobbying for those foreign governments with the Department of Justice. So this is the most important thing when it comes to the whole book. If Giuliani is acting as a foreign agent, that is a crime. And if he is doing it with the complicity of Donald Trump, that is a crime. And then it brings into a bigger question of, was the entire Trump administration selling out to foreign interests? And which is a big, big question that comes out of the book. And I'm not going to spoil you with all the details at this point, but I think that's enough for you to get a general idea. But you have to keep this in mind. I was digging into a Turkish money laundering and bribery case, and connecting that Turkish money laundering and bribery case to the president of Turkey. And that has criminal, national security, and geopolitical ramifications on that part as well. So you have to also keep in mind that Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States and is an active participant in the adjacent Syrian civil war. So you have this money laundering case on the other side, or one side, and the money laundering case is for the benefit of Iran. And on the other side, the United States needs Turkey as an ally for the Syrian civil war, for stationing aircraft or troops, or for intelligence gathering. So you have a major conflict. You have the individuals within the Turkish government aiding a money laundering activity that for the benefit of Iran that ran for $20+ billion. And also bear in mind that the Iranian government was under sanctions for its nuclear research into building nuclear weapons, and which is the whole reason why they weren't allowed to have this money in the first place. So essentially, this money launderer, his name is Reza Zarrab, he bribed Turkish officials to look the other way, as he would take money out of Turkish banks, convert it into gold or cash or diamonds, then move it through perhaps a third-party country into Iran for the benefit of those in Iran. And so you have a big question of how do you deal with this as the United States? You have a sovereign leader of the government of Turkey who may have been aiding Iranian money laundering for his own purposes. So that's kind of where I got to in the book, or the research, where I was like, wow, this is an incredibly interesting subject. I want to do more. So I recruited a journalist who would go on to interview former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, Rex Tillerson, and former National Security Advisor John Bolton. And the basic question of the interview was Donald Trump attempting to interfere in the Halk Bank prosecution? And Halk Bank is the name of the Turkish bank that was doing the money laundering. And so I recruited the journalist. The article was published actually on January 9th in Foreign Policy magazine, 3 days after the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So unfortunately, I don't think as many people may have seen that article because of other events on the outside. But, the attack on the Capitol kind of made me even more angry, because the things that I'm looking at is like extreme corruption for foreign powers. And then you have an attempt to overturn the election. By who? By Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani. So that's what really pushed me to write the book, is frankly anger at blatant corruption, at blatant trying to overthrow the constitutional rule that's been in the United States for over 250 years.
Yeah. So let's talk about Ukraine. So what were Giuliani and Lev Parnas actually doing there, and what did they hope to achieve through their back-channel dealings with Ukrainian prosecutors?
Giuliani and Parnas were part of a greater criminal conspiracy with Donald Trump. And their goal was in 2019 to try to corrupt the Ukrainian government into announcing criminal investigations into Joe Biden's son and his business dealings with the Ukrainian energy company Burisma, and then connecting the Ukrainian investigation to political attacks against Joe Biden, who was widely considered Trump's opposition for the 2020 presidential election. I think they're also trying to create an alternative public narrative to the then ongoing Russian election interference investigations and Trump's possible connections to the Russian interference. And because those investigations had been haunting the president for almost his entire term. And like the Kremlin, Trump and his allies, they sought to blame Russian interference on Ukraine and use it as a talking point against the Mueller investigation. So I think that's kind of the foundation of it. But according to Lev Parnas, he was asked to join the conspiracy at a Hanukkah party in December of 2018. And the theory that they were proposing, or the Trump conspiracy was proposing, is that Joe Biden as vice president had used his position as vice president to protect the energy company where his son was sitting on the board, and by using pressure on the Ukrainian government to fire the prosecutor in Ukraine, a guy by the name of Shokin. And the problem with the theory is Shokin was widely considered corrupt by the European Union, Britain, and the United States, and that he was actively blocking corruption investigations, apparently to protect Ukrainian oligarchs. So that's the problem with their conspiracy. The Giuliani and Parnas were seeking to find allies in the Petro Poroshenko government in Ukraine. This is again in end of 2018, going into 2019, and to pressure them to make an announcement about a criminal investigation against Joe Biden's son. But Poroshenko lost the presidential election to Zelensky in the spring of 2019. And so Giuliani and Parnas had then to seek inroads to Zelensky through oligarchs, curiously including a guy by the name of Dmitry Firtash, who was awaiting extradition from Austria to the United States on unrelated corruption charges. And Giuliani, through Parnas, sought the oligarchs' help in creating dirt on the Bidens. And in return, they would try to help him dismiss the criminal charges in the United States that were against him. So Giuliani and his allies, they would later approach the Justice Department to drop the charges against Firtash. And Firtash, through his legal proceedings in Austria, created an affidavit that accused Joe Biden of corruption. So in parallel to all of this, you had Giuliani and Parnas involved in trying to fire the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, a woman by the name of Marie Yovanovitch. This is all happening in the spring of 2019. And the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Yovanovitch, she was recalled first in the end of April of 2019 and then fired when she came back. What this seemed to be part of is a greater plot to force a change at the anti-corruption board of Ukraine's national gas company, Naftogaz. So they wanted to change the board, and then they wanted to sell American LNG through that board, with the acceptance of that board, to Ukraine. And that plot was connected to an American energy mogul, a guy by the name of Harry Sargent, who had also worked with Giuliani and Parnas in 2018 on a Venezuelan project to lift U.S. sanctions on the Venezuelan government so that Sargent's company could then exploit the country's vast oil reserves.
Yeah.
So essentially, you had two schemes going. One was about creating dirt on the Bidens, or getting dirt on the Bidens. And the other, you have changes of the Naftogaz anti-corruption board, which was installed by the West after the first war with Russia and Ukraine. And the reason why they installed the board was because prior to that war, the energy industry in Ukraine was rife with corruption, specifically from one Dmitry Firtash. So it's interesting that Giuliani would include Dmitry Firtash as one of the oligarchs that he would try to chase down to help give aid to. There also seemed to be a second American LNG project to sell to Ukraine, this time coming from Trump's Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry. And this project also sought to put handpicked energy guys on the anti-corruption board and then sell gas to Ukraine through a U.S. energy company that Perry had just prior to becoming the Secretary of Energy, he was on the board. So again, you have an unusual conflict of interest. And Perry titled his Ukraine LNG sales push as, quote, Freedom Gas. I'm guessing Freedom Gas, the title of it, is an implication that American LNG sales would replace Russian sales to Ukraine that had previously dominated both Ukrainian politics and its energy industry. So you need to kind of go backwards a little bit and bear in mind that Russia had been using energy sales to Ukraine as a political tool to tie Kiev to the Kremlin's interests for at least 10 years.
And they could have been doing that with Europe as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah. They hadn't pulled the trigger on Europe at that point, but they could where they wanted to. And so this Russia raising and lowering gas prices to get the Kiev or the Ukrainian government to do its bidding, that was in part the precipitation for the Kremlin's first invasion of Ukraine, because the Kremlin thought it was losing control of their, we'll call it client state, maybe even a colony, if you will. And prior to that, prior to the war, you had the Kremlin financing Dmitry Firtash as a point man for sales of Russian gas to Ukraine. And later, Firtash would begin investing into Ukraine using the profits of those gas sales, which he got on discount. And it was financed by the Kremlin to buy energy infrastructure in Ukraine, to buy radio stations in Ukraine, to buy TV stations in Ukraine, and then to finance a political party aligned with the Kremlin. So effectively, like Firtash was trying to buy power in Ukraine through corruption financed by Moscow. So when you're talking about Perry's Freedom Gas Initiative, this was an attempt to replace Firtash in Moscow's influence. But the way Parnas and Perry were willing to replace Moscow's influence was essentially replacing one set of corruption with another set of corruption, where they would be able to force the sale of U.S. gas from specific companies to Ukraine. The big question that I had at this point is whether or not these two LNG endeavors were one and the same, or if they were separate and they were maybe perhaps piggybacking on one another. And I couldn't conclude that they were part of one corrupt endeavor, but both of the projects, they included conversations with Donald Trump. They both were happening at the same time. Both projects required buy-ins from the Ukrainian government. Both seemed to have indirect support from the president of the United States. And most importantly, both LNG projects were were held away from the American public. So it was under their radar. No one knew this was happening. And both the LNG projects and getting dirt on the Biden projects were also part of the same process that had overlaps in personnel, i.e., the president, Rudy Giuliani, Rick Perry, the inner circle of Trump's cabinet was essentially in part of all of this. So, yeah, that's the basic summation of what they were doing in Ukraine. But the details are deeper in the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. Would you describe their work as shadow diplomacy or something else?
It seems to me that both Giuliani and Parnas were acting as political fixtures for clients. They would do dirty meetings to keep their clients clean. This was certainly true for the two in Turkey in 2017 and in Venezuela in 2018. And in 2019, you had them doing the same things with Ukrainians connected to corruption in Ukraine. So, I looked at the duo and as tools of the protagonist of the story rather than the protagonist of the story. I like to think more of hidden protagonists that we don't really talk about in the book, which is the corrupt government leaders that are in Turkey or in Venezuela or Russia, that through indirect means, through intermediaries, they sought influence in U.S. Political circles through people like Rudy Giuliani, or I haven't talked about him yet, but I'm going to mention him now, a guy by the name of Michael Flynn, who was Trump's first national security advisor. We'll get into Michael Flynn a little bit later on, though. But essentially, these countries were using disinformation or influence operations. And you also had, frankly, Donald Trump, who was using the same tools of disinformation as a tool of governing the United States. So I think like the term shadow diplomacy, maybe it misses the fact that the actions of Giuliani and Parnas, they were unsanctioned by the U.S. government and were in fact private projects done for the purpose of private individuals. So perhaps maybe I should say something along the lines of a private State Department rather than a shadow State Department.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So in the book, there's the phrase quid pro quo with Ukrainian prosecutors. So how much of this was about domestic US politics and how much was sort of served a broader foreign influence, particularly from the Kremlin?
I think much of Giuliani and Parnas' actions were focused on domestic actors, i.e. U.S. energy companies and Trump himself. Their goals seem to have been of staying in power by building counter narratives through disinformation. And this clearly rings of how Russia was operating during the 2016 election, which is when they aided, or the Russian government aided, Trump's rise in American politics. Yet for much of their efforts, I find that the domestic and foreign influence operations are unconnected. That is until Giuliani and Parnas recruited Dmitry Firtash, as Firtash was the Kremlin's central influencer in Ukraine and probably its most important oligarch at the time. But Firtash's support could be connected to the Kremlin, but I doubt it. However, as the first Trump impeachment hearing started in the United States, Giuliani was gallivanting around Ukraine, meeting other Russian influencers in country. And those were clearly aligned with Moscow. And he was talking to them for a documentary that he was doing that blamed Ukraine for interfering with the US elections in 2016 and accusing Joe Biden and his son of corruption, neither of which were true, but they were also talking points of the Kremlin for years in disinformation channels. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You have connections that overlap between foreign interests and domestic interests for Donald Trump, as well as energy interests. However, I don't see direct coordination between the two. So, on a separate note, from Ukraine, that is, I would say I did find a great deal of evidence that there is an ongoing Russian-Turkish coordination at the senior political levels on several fronts. And this comes back to the money laundering case that I mentioned earlier, which I also referred to as the Hawk Bank case. And this cooperation began somewhere around 2014, give or take. And this starts with an undersea gas pipeline deal between Moscow and Ankara. And you have to also bear in mind the context of the time. So 2014, Russia's fighting a war with Ukraine. And with that, there is a pipeline that transfers gas into Ukraine and then continues on into Europe. And what Russia was trying to do with building a new deal and a new gas pipeline between Moscow and Ankara is they were trying to hedge bets whether or not that pipeline would be open, or better, if that pipeline in Ukraine wasn't open anymore, then they could continue to funnel Russian gas into Europe through Turkey. And which something that they're still trying to do today with Ankara's help. So while they were trying to cut essentially Ukraine out of the Russian gas transitioning products in its pipelines through its land, they were also aiding Erdogan in his economic endeavors in Turkey. But as you know, Russia tends to use gas as a weapon, or at least energy as a weapon. So my suspicion is they're trying to embolden Erdogan to act as a proxy for Russia to send gas for all intents and purposes. And that comes with a number of political strings attached.
Yeah, that makes
There's
some sense.
Yeah, there is also in the book. Actually, I didn't include this one in the book. There was a well-connected Russian who was helping build out Turkish cultural institutions in the United States in 2015 and 2016. And that those cultural institutions would then become part of the Turkish government's influence operations in the United States in 16, 17, 18, and beyond. There was also a Russian oligarch who served as an unofficial intermediary between Russia and Turkey in 2016. That same oligarch in 2017 would be aiding Turkey to find lobbyists in the United States in 2017. And that same Russian oligarch, his name is Farkhad Akhmedov, would go on to accompany Giuliani associate Lev Parnas to an RNC donors retreat in March 2017, which is, by the way, putting it again in context, the same time when the Russian investigations in the United States were heating up. So I got to say, it's very, very strange that Akhmedov would appear at an RNC event. What's even stranger is that Akhmedov's appearance at this RNC event would go unnoticed in both the Mueller report, which was an investigation about the Russian elections interference, as well as possible coordination with the Trump campaign. It wasn't in the report. And the Senate intelligence report that came out in late 2020 also didn't mention Farkhad Akhmedov. Both those reports concluded, however, that Russia had sent clandestine intermediaries to approach the Trump transition. Somewhere around about a dozen clandestine intermediaries from November 2016 going into January 2017. So both those reports report that, but they don't report this guy. And this guy is in the heart of American politics in the Republican circles at an RNC donors retreat. And being that Akhmedov is a Russian national, he wouldn't be able to donate to the politicians in America in the first place. So his appearances should have set off alarm bells connected to the Russian interference, but somehow they didn't.
Yeah, that's crazy. Mm.
Yeah. Further, I mentioned to you about Michael Flynn. Uh, and Flynn was Trump's first national security advisor, and he lasted, I think, all of total of 22 days. And before he resigned, and he would later admit to lying to the FBI about conversations with the Russian ambassador. He would also admit to acting as an unregistered foreign agent for the Turkish government. Oddly enough, or perhaps fitting with character, Trump pardoned him as he was leaving office the first time around. But going even deeper still into Russian-Turkish coordination, perhaps you remember that Turkey bought a Russian air defense system, the S-400. That happened, I believe it was, they announced the order in 2017, I believe it was. And as a result of that, Turkey would be kicked out of the F-35 fighter program that the United States had with a number of European allies. Perhaps what you didn't know is that the Turkish ministers were charged in the United States for bribery and money laundering and breaking U.S. sanctions on Iran just a few days before the announcement to buy the missile system. In short, I think Erdogan in Turkey was trying to leverage Russian relations against the U.S. prosecutions and was trying to use it as a threat to push America to back off the prosecutions because those prosecutions would lead to the president of Turkey.
Let's take a break and be right back with more. You argue that autocrats from Turkey, Venezuela, Russia, and beyond have seen the Trump administration as sort of a window of opportunity. So do you think they formed an unofficial alliance of mutual interest?
I think the authoritarian leaders of those countries saw Trump as transactional and on everything, and that he was untethered to American principles and thus exploitable. So have you heard of the historian Anne Applebaum?
Yeah, she's been on the show.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. So then she previewed my book ahead of me.
Authoritarian Inc. Yeah, very good book.
Yeah, she lays out a strong case that authoritarian governments are aligning against the West, and they're doing so to avoid accountability for their crimes against their own people. And my book is a lot like hers, except on steroids. My book lays out the details that show that Russia was clearly working with other authoritarian governments in Turkey and in Venezuela, and that they had been doing the same in Ukraine prior to 2014. So I think that the authoritarian leaders see Trump as a kindred spirit, and he sees the same in them. And yes, I certainly think that there is an unofficial authoritarian alliance that is continuing to expand to the present day. I mean, right now you have Russia fighting Ukraine using weapons from North Korea and Iran, supported by economic support from China. And you have Venezuela also making threats to its neighbors all at the same time. So all collectively, you see multiple signs of unofficial alliance, and you see also Turkey breaking away from Western interests as well.
And Michael Flynn himself was embroiled in a scandal that involved a kidnap plot, didn't it, for the Turkish?
For Fethullah Gulen, yeah. He was... Fethullah Gulen, for your audience, is I should say was, because he died not too long ago. He was a Turkish cleric who fled Turkey in, I believe, 1999 and had lived in the United States for more or less 20 years. And he was proclaimed as the nemesis to Erdogan in Turkey. And Erdogan was encouraging the U.S. government to try to extradite him back to the Turkish government, where I assumed he would receive criminal charges for a variety of things, because Erdogan had suggested that he was behind an attempted coup against Erdogan in Turkey in 2016 and was was creating information that would lead to the prosecution of the money laundering and bribery scheme. So you had all of this stuff kind of, we'll say, interacting with one another. So in the case of Michael Flynn, what the Turkish government was doing is they were encouraging Mike Flynn to be more forceful in trying to get the extradition to happen. To the point of offering him, I don't remember the exact sum, I think it was $15 million in a conversation to do so. So yeah, Mike Flynn was certainly part of it too. And what he instead did, or this is what we know that he did, is he wrote an op-ed that ironically came out election day in 2016 that attacked Golan and his operations, which are charitable operations in the United States, Muslim charter schools in the United States, and accusing them of terrorism that connects to Al-Qaeda. And all of this is false information, but Michael Flynn, who was being paid by a Turkish government intermediary, a guy by the name of Ekim Atepkin, paid him to do it. I think somewhere around $400,000, give or take, to do so. So the Turkish government was fully entwined into influence operations in the United States.
Well, how did figures like Reza Zarrab and Erdogan's intermediaries undermine U.S. investigations?
So, as I had already mentioned, Iran was under sanctions for its nuclear program, and that stopped business transactions with Western financial banks to move money for Iran one way or another for this for oil or gas sales that Iran was doing. And so what Zarrab did for the Iranian government is he would pay off Turkish officials. Then he would take money out of Turkish banks where the money had been frozen from oil and gas sales from Iran, and then change that money into other forms of money, or gold or diamonds, and then move that either directly to Iran or through a third-party country to Iran. What happened is that Zarrab was arrested in, I believe it was December of 2013. And the arrest was coinciding with a series of raids on government officials and their families across the country of Turkey. And what they were investigating was this money laundering scheme. But what they were looking at is less on the money laundering scheme and more on the bribery side of the scheme. And so you had these raids that were happening of government ministers and their families. According to Turkish press, there was going to be a second raid going, we'll say, up the ladder of Turkish politicians. And what happened is the raid never happened. And the short answer of why it didn't happen is that the prime minister, who was Erdogan at the time of Turkey, he put out a decree that fired the police investigators, the prosecutors, and the judges that were investigating the case. And we know this because Zarrab would later turn state's evidence in the United States and explain it. Explain how he bribed the Turkish officials to get out of jail and get the case shut down in Turkey. So by the end of 2014, Zarrab is out of prison, and everybody that had been raided, that had been detained by Turkish police, they were all freed, and all the prosecutors and the police and the judges that were involved in the case, they were all fired or transferred. Then in 2016, the case reopens in the United States. This time it's the Southern District of New York that's investigating the pass-through of the money laundering scheme into a U.S. bank before it ends in Iran. And so this is happening in the spring of 2016. I believe Zarrab was arrested traveling with his family to Florida and going to Disney World in the United States. And they arrest him as he comes in. There's a question of whether or not he allowed himself to be arrested because he was worried about his own security and what he knew. But that's a more of a conspiracy theory question to ask later on. But Trump becomes president in November of 2016. And by the end of January, I believe, of 2017, Giuliani is becoming Zarab's lawyer. This is the same time that Giuliani is acting as an unofficial advisor to the President of the United States. And so Giuliani goes on to Turkey to talk to Erdogan about, how to deal with this political situation. Around that same time, Giuliani is sitting down with Trump and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in the Oval Office and asks Tillerson, with Trump sitting there, to intervene in Zarab's case on national security grounds. And Tillerson, as I laid out about the interview that I recruited a journalist to do, said, this stuff is illegal. I can't do this. It would be pressuring prosecutors to drop a case for the benefit of who? For the benefit of Iran? You can't do that. Giuliani also was pressing for the extradition, as I mentioned, of the Turkish cleric, Fethullah Gulen. And Trump, apparently in response to Giuliani, was asking government branches in early 2017 to check on Gulen's activities in the United States and whether or not they could freeze money that was going to Gulen in order to kind of force something to happen to him. Giuliani would also later push for a trade between the U.S. government and Turkey for a trade of Reza Zarrab for an illegally detained pastor, a guy by the name of Pastor Brunson. Perhaps you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Pastor Brunson was detained in right after the coup in 2016 against Erdogan, and he was accused of being in the CIA, essentially. And Giuliani here is trying to push for a trade, Zarab for Pastor Brunson. Turkey would continue to push for a trade later on, not for Zarab, but to close the Halkbank prosecutions in return for Brunson. So either Giuliani is either a huge fan of Turkey and its president, or he is acting as a foreign agent of the Turkish government. So, and that comes back to, what is the foreign agent?
Indeed. Well, one of the striking patterns in your book is obviously how lobbying, donations, and so-called cultural organizations are kind of becoming vessels of influence. Is this the sort of 21st century model of espionage?
That's an interesting question. I would make the argument that all this has been around for a long time. In America, we've essentially legalized corruption by allowing lobbyists in the first place. The donations issue has also been around for a long time. However, it's become worse in time in the United States after a Supreme Court decision known as Citizens United in 2010. And that decision opened the floodgates for political donations. It also allowed corporations to give political donations and allowed unlimited funding of super PACs or political action committees. The court decision made raising money for politicians more important than before, and it created a race to get political donors' money, and frankly made those same politicians more susceptible to donors' requests, if you will. So as far as the cultural organizations and institutions and their use as political tools for foreign governments, that's also not really that new of an activity. However, what the Turkish government did was use those cultural institutions as more of a direct arm of the Turkish government, with Turkish government officials giving it orders. And that's unusual, as they were intermixing the purposes of the cultural institution with Turkish foreign policy. And again, we got to remember, Turkey is supposed to be a U.S. ally. And here they are acting much more like how Russia, or for that matter, the Soviet Union, had intermixed their cultural institutions, for example, ballerinas as spies for the purposes of state espionage. So I'm not so sure any of this is new. It's just now more in the forefront than it has been before.
Yeah. So a lot of what you describe falls under the umbrella of disinformation and information laundering. So how were narratives seeded, disguised, and legitimized in US media and politics?
Let me start with a foundational understanding. So Giuliani and Trump use Fox News and other conservative platforms to launder disinformation. They use it to create an alternate reality. And in doing so, they put it all into the American bloodstream. Then they get influencers to back it, and it deepens the echo chamber. With Ukraine and Giuliani, partisan Trump's actions in Ukraine, Giuliani worked with a journalist, and let me use the word journalist in quotes.
Yep.
By the name of John Solomon. And he worked for an online news site called The Hill that focuses on Washington politics. Working together, Solomon would write articles for the benefit of Giuliani's clients. And then Giuliani and Solomon would go into the news platforms to discuss the article as factual. And then after that, it would get amplified by MAGA influencers, i.e. Donald Trump Jr. and his father, until it would become part of the mainstream. And then the disinformation has been laundered and Giuliani's hands are clean. They did this specifically for Dmitry Firtash, the Ukrainian oligarch that I mentioned earlier, who was Russia's point man in Ukraine. Giuliani and Trump, they also use similar tactics to see disinformation, what would ultimately lead to January 6, 2021. Yeah. They seeded doubts in the media for months before claiming election fraud. Then they activated their fervent supporters to march on the Capitol building. Russia used similar tactics in the 2016 election. One might even say Trump and Giuliani adopted the Russian tactics for their own usage. So, yeah. I think that how the Russian disinformation and information laundering, it's essentially became molded with conservative politics. Maybe not by direct coordination, but they certainly adopted the techniques.
Yeah. They put a sort of story out and in a certain publication, and then it kind of gets picked up by others, basically.
Yeah. And the Russians, in 2016, they did hack and release operations. They did disinformation in the comment sections. They created false news websites, and then they would also use specific influencers in the United States to further promote all of this stuff. And collectively, it overwhelms the social psychology of an individual.
Yeah, and there have been recent cases of social media influencers who have been found in the pay, or at least getting money from the Russian government. So getting a lot of money
indirectly.
Yeah, indirectly. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a Canadian influencer company that was operating in the United States, being paid by Russia Today. I think it was like $500,000 an episode.
Yeah, I wish I was getting that kind of level of money, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy number. And like the influencers that were receiving the pay were, at the time, from what I've read, they kind of said, well, like our numbers don't add up to this. Like it doesn't make sense that we're getting paid so much money to push these talking points. But what they didn't understand is they were Russian talking points, and money is not a question in this conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, indeed, you're right. There is direct Russian government to conservative influencer pipeline at one point.
Yeah, definitely. And also the role of, you mentioned it before, Russia Today. I know in the past you used to get, you'd get fringe characters, etc., would be put on Russia Today as a legitimate representative of some, faction of Western politics, etc. It came up a lot during Brexit and so on. You'd have
you had Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
And you had Nigel Farage on one side, and you had Jeremy Corbyn on the other side. Russia couldn't lose in that situation. You had Nigel Farage, who wanted to break up the European Union for all intents and purposes. And on the other side of it, you had Corbyn, who wanted to do away with nuclear deterrence.
Yeah.
For Great Britain. So it's just like, wow.
Perfect combination, really, for Russia.
Yeah, it's perfect. You can't lose on either side of it. All you're doing is you're trying to whittle down the middle of British politics in order to break the backbone of British politics.
Yeah, indeed. So all of this, what we've described seems very similar to sort of tactics used and pioneered by the Soviets, known as active measures during the Cold War. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would entirely agree. Russia certainly expanded their old influence techniques to the modern age. The Soviet Union used their intelligence services to place disinformation in the West for decades. I mean, you think back to claims by odd news sources in who knows where, far, far away from most other newspapers, that claimed that the AIDS virus was created by the U.S. government to kill Black people in the 1980s. Or If you want to go back even further, there was disinformation in play during the starvation crisis in Ukraine in the 1930s. The Russian government was claiming not to know anything about it. It wasn't happening, and yet Russia was starving millions of Ukrainians. Today, like the difficulty is placing unattributable disinformation in foreign countries is really, really easy. I mean, with the right amount of resources, an intelligence agency or a private individual, they can place thousands of articles daily worldwide, either through influencers on Facebook or on X or YouTube or TikTok or manufactured news sites.
Yeah.
And Russia has expanded these disinformation channels first in Europe and the United States, but later in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America. And the disinformation war expansion has been moving at lightning speed, and it's localizing its content and breeding it further and further discontent. What I really worry about is that this disinformation and information laundering is becoming more and more commonplace. It's moving from authoritarian countries that use it to control information in their own countries into democracies. And what it happens in the United States, for example, or in Great Britain, it's corrupting the social psychology of whole societies and allowing cynical politicians to gain power. And then they further corrupt the democracy. So in my view, it's getting much, much worse, not better.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And I had a guest on not long ago, Eric O'Neill, who made the claim that he believes next year about 96% of content on the internet will be artificially created, which is quite a dramatic amount. And
Sweet
yeah,
Jesus.
so
Yeah, I remember in 2016 and 2017, my greatest fear when I was going to the US government, my greatest fear was it wasn't going to be just Russia. It was going to be everybody doing this going forward. And I don't mean every country, I mean every political party in every country. Not just the political parties, corporations are going to be doing it, and they're just going to consistently do it. And like what we collectively as society are going to lose is frankly the
yeah,
truth.
yeah. And you see it in alternative media, etc. The space I'm in, it's awash with both misinformation and disinformation, and not all of it from state backing or whatever, but there's just so much nonsense out there now. It's getting harder and harder to determine what's fact and what's not.
I see that on Facebook as well. Like you see like an article that, I don't know, I'm just going to make this up on my top of my head that, aliens landed in Nebraska and here's the photos of it, like that type of thing. It gets people to look at it and it brings clicks. It brings revenue for these social media companies and maybe for the individuals that are posting it. But what it does is frankly a detriment to society and detriment to the observation that there is a truth. And there is a factual representation of what's happening day to day in life.
Yeah, indeed. Looking back at the kind of state-sponsored side of it, do you think this sort of kind of narrative warfare is more dangerous than traditional espionage because it kind of works through soft power and familiarity?
Yeah, I would say that changing the anchor of it's changing the anchor of reality that people were taught in schools. What is up, what is down, what happened in 1943, what happened in 1944, blah blah blah. It's sowing division that politicians can exploit. Russia did this across Europe. Case example, Brexit. Case example, in the United States in the U.S. election. Trump is now doing the same thing to the American people. He's essentially traumatizing the American public for his own political gain.
Mm. Yeah. You get a kind of fire hose of information coming out, and it's hard to keep up. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that you mentioned a good point there. It's not just that there's disinformation. It's the repetition of the disinformation, the frequency of the disinformation that makes it overwhelming. I think I read somewhere in the Washington Post, either yesterday or the day before, that like Trump is posting 2 or 3 times the amount of posts on his social media platform than he did on social media platforms in his first administration, which means it's getting even worse.
Yeah, and everybody was exhausted by that. So yeah, no, that's not good at all. That's not good at all.
Yeah.
You show how Giuliani and his circle kind of bypassed official diplomatic and legal channels. What institutional weaknesses allowed this kind of behavior to flourish?
I don't think it's an institutional weakness. I think it's the people. People who know better but go along with it anyway. the elected officials, the political influencers, some members of the Supreme Court that decided the president himself was above the law. And so, they defer their power to the president instead of maintaining it themselves. Sometimes they do it in the fear of retribution. Sometimes they do it based on their political ideology. But the rule of law is only going to work if people support it. And if not, then institutions themselves die. And the words written on legal documents, they don't matter anymore, whether it be the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. But yeah, I think that answers the question.
Yeah.
I honestly don't think it's the institutions. I think it's much more the people.
Yeah. How do you interpret the relative lack of public outrage about all of this? Has corruption become so normalized, or is it just too complex to follow now?
Well, I mean, first you had Russia and then Trump seeding disinformation and, in essence, changing people's anchors of reality. Perhaps you've heard of the Overton window.
Yeah.
But essentially, for your audience, the Overton window is the level of acceptance of actions that can be shifted if you have influencers that are willing to shift it. And Trump has clearly shifted what is moral and what is legal. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of tapped into like a certain level of nihilism that if everybody is doing something or everyone believes that all politicians are corrupt, then it's no longer really a crime anymore. And as you mentioned before, it's also the sheer scale of the disinformation, leaving people to wonder, what is noise and what is important. So I know people who knew what happened on January 6th, days after, or even months after. They knew exactly what happened. They knew that Trump brought those people, then he pushed and encouraged those people, and his allies encouraged those people to march on the Capitol building with the plan of trying to delay or stop the confirmation of Joe Biden as president. And some of those people have willingly gone along with Trump to avoid admitting to themselves that Trump's actions were unacceptable and criminal, or else they too would be responsible for putting a criminal in the White House. And I think some of us, certainly I have, lost friends over this because they're losing their anchor of reality. It's hard to be able to have a conversation about what is right and wrong when you can't agree with what even the basic facts are of the conversation.
Yeah. There's a lot of relationships have been ended over this topic or similar topics. It's quite astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It's frankly depressing, but I mean, I have to break myself away from people that aren't willing to live in a reality because otherwise they try to suck you into their reality.
Yeah, it's like a mind virus. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's disinformation itself. It is a virus. Whether or not people recognize it, it's just a social virus of sorts.
Yeah, and it really has clung on to a lot of people. Yeah, it's been it's worrying. It is worrying, and it's a big problem for both of our societies, UK and the US, and probably Europe as a whole.
Yeah, and as I said before, I don't see this ending anytime soon. I see it getting worse. I see us going into, if you will, a golden age of disinformation. And you're seeing it transfer from authoritarian countries, as I mentioned before, into democracies. And that democratic political thinkers in those democracies are willing to use it.
Yeah. Well, are we dealing then with a failure of media, a failure of politics, or both when it comes to holding these sort of influence peddlers accountable?
I think it's clearly both. But, there is an unwritten social contract for journalists to educate the public. But instead, many of them have focused on sensationalism to get eyeballs and therefore revenues. Politicians actually do have a fiduciary duty to protect the public and democracy in their countries. But many of them are now worried about political retribution or their popularity over their duties. Others simply don't even care and look at their job as a reality TV show that sets them up for the next future job as a TV network star. So I think the failure goes all the way around. People that journalists that look in such a short window that they don't look at the bigger scheme of things, and they don't choose to educate their audiences. And then you have the politicians who are happy to go along with the scheme.
Yeah, I agree. So looking at Trump's return to office through the lens of your book, The Persuasion Game, what does this moment reveal about the long-term outlook for US democracy and its vulnerability to external influence?
Well, I mentioned Autocracy Inc. in Applebaum's book. And made that comparison to my book and saying my book's kind of hers on steroids. in my book, I look at democracy in Venezuela, in Turkey, and in Russia, and how those democracies were lost to authoritarianism. And they all lost the rule of law due to the president's corruption and his refusal to be accountable for crimes. And instead, the leaders of those countries, they changed their governments to protect themselves. In Turkey, I had already mentioned about the firing of policemen and judges and such. Later on, I mentioned there would also be a coup against the president of Turkey, which I'm not even sure was a coup. I lean more in the direction of it was an attempted arrest, because the first time that they tried to arrest the president, they were all fired and some of them went to prison. So after the coup, martial law was imposed on Turkey. And while martial law was imposed on Turkey, which, by the way, ran for 2 years of martial law, the president changed the constitution. And now he has been in power since 2014. It's 2025. So 10 years now. And he's talking about changing the constitution again, which is interesting because his term limit's coming up.
Yes.
So it's a good time to change the constitution. You may remember this, maybe you don't. This happened also in Russia. You had Putin in the early 2000s as the president, switched to prime minister, he switched to the position of prime minister, and his prime minister became the president. And then after that one, I think it was 5 years, they changed it back. And the president became the prime minister again, and Putin became the president again. And they actually joked about it. And there's actually a video of them talking about whose turn it is to become the president. So like, that's how much of a joke it's really became in their countries. And in the case of Venezuela, you had a democratic government that was an ally of the United States for decades. And a socialist comes to power, it completely changes the system, changes the constitution, destroys the congressional system of Venezuela and creates his own congressional system, because the congressional opposition was outnumbering his supporters in Congress.
Yeah.
So I think if I were to kind of look at this in the lens of the book, my book is trying to make the point of saying, hey, if you don't fight for your democracy when you see this authoritarianism approaching, you will lose it, because the institutions, they only stand up if the people are there to support them.
Here's a wider question for a moment. Do you think enough young people even understand the importance of democracy anymore?
Do I think young people understand democracy anymore? So I'm going to use the United States since I'm an American citizen. We stopped. So when I went through high school, I had, I think, a year and a half of civics education. And of course, I studied history and politics in university, so I had even greater civics education. But there was an encouragement during the Obama administration to push towards STEM fields, i.e. physics, engineering, the sciences, and to lessen the amount of civics education in schools. And I think as a result, young people have less civics education. And I think thanks to Russian disinformation and frankly other disinformation, they have learned less and less to trust their own governments. And of course, in the United States, with the Iraq War, I think we gave them license to not trust the U.S. government entirely. And with certain revelations of Edward Snowden about surveillance, I think also gave license for people not to trust democracies or intelligence agencies in the West. And I think there's a carryover effect to the present day, where I think young people with this collective history in the past, plus a lack of civics education, don't really understand how government works.
Yeah. And I think it collided with a lot of that sort of post-Watergate sort of narratives that were popular in sort of our culture of the 90s, like with the film JFK, The X-Files, etc.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Well, I mean, if you look from, like, say, the 1960s, 1970s, you see a dramatic decrease in trust. And when you hit the internet age, it accelerates. So I think it's the proliferation is also a factor in whether or not people trust democracies. The proliferation, that is, of disinformation.
Yeah. Are we seeing a kind of rise of a new kind of covert action conducted not by spies, but by lobbyists, donors, and political operatives?
So I would make the argument that these actions have been going on for decades, and it's why the U.S. government, or why Congress, created the Foreign Agents Registration Act dating back to the 1930s. I mean, we've seen Paul Manafort. He's an interesting character in which, just for your audience, he was a campaign manager for Donald Trump, a voluntary campaign manager who was not paid. And prior to that, he was the campaign manager of one Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, who was at worst, well, at best, maybe a puppet for the puppeteer in the Kremlin. So, and in another case, we have somebody like Roger Stone. He was a political operative of Donald Trump and has been a Republican political operative since the 1980s. And collectively, between the two of them, they've been blurring the lines of legality and morality for decades now. And politicians have allowed it since they are rewarded by the system, i.e., if you have lobbyists, they're willing to donate or support the politician when they're trying to get reelected. And so the politician wants to get reelected, so they don't want to change the system. It's the conundrum that we face. Our government allows it, so of course foreign countries are going to take advantage of it as well.
Yeah. Let's take a break and be right back with more. Ultimately, what do you want listeners to take away from your book?
I think the book shows how political corruption turned foreign democracies into modern day autocracies. The book shows how those autocracies then spread their corruption into the United States, and Trump and Giuliani then allowed it all to flourish and infect our government and influence political decisions during the first Trump administration. I see that same infection, spreading even faster in the second Trump term, with him adopting the autocratic playbook that I saw that happened in Turkey. And if the American public doesn't push back, they may very well lose their democracy, and with it, potentially global democracies.
Yeah, I think there's a real danger of that.
You kind of look at or at least I kind of look at the United States as a big brother for democracies around the world. And when you lose big brother, then you're able to be bullied by the next guy.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of comments about January the 6th, a lot of people were surprised that even happened, and sort of, should we say, the legal fallout from it after that.
Yeah, there's a part in my book towards the end of the book that it specifically covers January 6th, and I present one might call it a conspiracy theory, but I would say the evidence provided in the book points to this direction, that the attempt to overthrow the U.S. constitutional system and keep Donald Trump in power in 2020 may be directly related to the material in the book, i.e., Trump and Giuliani and Parnas were implicated in the extortion attempt of the Ukrainian president. But what it did is, when that impeachment started, it also opened the door to everything Giuliani and Parnas were doing. And when you move forward in time, past the impeachment, you get into COVID, and Trump's numbers were already going down. And in the summer of 2020, you have President Trump, out of nowhere, fire the U.S. prosecutor at the SDNY. And the SDNY happened to be investigating Hawk Bank, the money laundering and bribery scandal that originated in Turkey, Lev Parnas, and Rudy Giuliani, all at the same time. And I think that Donald Trump fired the prosecutor to try to freeze the case from going forward. Why? Because the election cycle was coming around. If Rudy Giuliani was charged or even raided by the FBI during this time period, it would sink Donald Trump's election. After all, Giuliani was Trump's private lawyer. So then you have even bigger questions, as I mentioned before. Did Donald Trump know what Rudy Giuliani was doing? Because if he did, then there's other issues that come up in ramifications. So, yeah, I think that answers the greater question here. Like, I think there is a direct correlation between the firing of that prosecutor and later on the attempts to overturn the election, because also the people that were trying to overturn the election are related to the investigations I was doing about Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas. Who tried to overthrow the election? Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani. There are two affidavits that I describe in the book that started Trump's attempts to overturn the election in the court system in the United States. And both of those affidavits were false. One was from a former Venezuelan national, and another one was from a private security company in Texas. Both of those affidavits have direct connections to a Congressman Pete Sessions. And that Congressman Pete Sessions popped up in Ukraine with Giuliani and Parnas, and popped up with Giuliani and Parnas in Venezuela. And I find that fascinating, because the one question I don't think anyone in media has asked is, why would you risk it all on this? Why would you risk going to prison if you don't succeed in overturning the election results? And there's a good reason for them to want to stay in power, because if they stay in power, they can freeze the investigations and prosecutions from going forward.
Yeah.
And there's also, by the way, the same Rick Perry that I mentioned, who was the Secretary of Energy that was involved in potential LNG sales to Ukraine. He had sent a text message to the Trump campaign that said, hey, try to push the results back to state legislatures, which is exactly what they tried to do. So here you have Pete Sessions, congressman, that was directly related to the stuff I was investigating. Here you have Rick Perry, who's directly related to stuff that I was investigating. Here you have Giuliani and Donald Trump directly in the stuff that I was investigating. And then there's the big question of, why would you go so far?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, Chad, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to add that's important to you? Because we've covered quite a lot, but there might be something else you want to add there.
I kind of created a couple questions thinking that we may have a follow-up conversation here. I clearly lay out in the book that Rudy Giuliani was taking on foreign clients while simultaneously acting as the president's advisor and later as the president's private lawyer. And as the president's lawyer, Giuliani reported no compensation for the job. In effect, Giuliani was working for the president for free, but taking on clients outside of the U.S. government. And he was also, in fact, running a private State Department of sorts for his clients. In one interview of the first Trump administration, Giuliani elucidated the fact that he wasn't getting paid by the president, but he was getting paid by his clients. And he was bringing his clients to the highest levels of the U.S. government, but not in the court of law. So his actions suggest lobbying. And he never registered as a foreign agent. And Rudy A. Giuliani would be investigated for that very thing by the SDNY from 2019 to 2022. Then the SDNY announced that he wouldn't be charged. Given the substantial evidence I lay out in the book, I'd like to know why he wasn't charged. So that's one big question. Also, given that Giuliani was lobbying both the president of the United States and senior members of the government, what was the extent of the president's involvement in Giuliani's schemes? How much did he know about those schemes? How much did he facilitate those schemes? How much was he complicit in those schemes? And that's a question that I can't answer. I would love for the U.S. government or congressional investigations, frankly, to follow up, because the amount of information that I've provided in the book is overwhelming to say that Giuliani was acting as a foreign agent. Another question, Giuliani and Trump, as I mentioned, they tried to overturn the results of the election. Were they trying to overturn the results of the election to stay in power? Were they trying to do it to stay in power, to block the investigations? Similar to something that happened in Turkey. And The firing of the prosecutor at the FDNY I mentioned in the summer of 2020, was he fired to protect Giuliani and thereby protect Trump, as I had mentioned? So, like, these are questions that are outstanding, and I can't answer them personally, but I would hope to God that some government agency would investigate them because they need to be answered. There's also one final question. When it comes to Venezuela and Ukraine, Giuliani and partners were working together. Were they working together in Venezuela? Because they both were working in parallel for the same goal. But did they know they were doing it together, or were they doing it separately but just in parallel? And again, questions I can't answer. And I think one last question. I mentioned a Russian oligarch going to an RNC donors retreat while the Russian investigations were going on. And this was in the context of other Russian clandestine emissaries trying to approach not the US government, but Trump's inner circle, separate from the US government. Was Akhmedov acting for the Turkish government in helping the Turkish government get lobbyists? Or was he acting as an intermediary for the Russian government to help the Turkish government? What was his purpose at going to the RNC donors retreat? We don't know. These are outstanding questions that go back to the Russian investigations, to be frank, because how is it that a Russian oligarch during that time period never got flagged?
Yeah. And I've noticed as well, the popular consensus in the US, and I think it's wrong, is that the Russia investigations didn't reveal anything in the end and that there was nothing wrong. And I think that's incorrect.
Yeah. For a person who has read every single volume of the Mueller report and every single volume of the Senate Intelligence report, that certainly is not true. And I lay out a number of bits of that in the book as well, where I describe in detail through how Russia operated and how they put intelligence agents into American politics. There's a woman by the name of Maria Butina who, in the book, who used her connections to the NRA, the National Rifle Association of the United States, to get into conservative politics through gun circles, and then use those conservative political positions to get close to presidential candidates, i.e. Republican presidential candidates. And that she was able to get close to, I think it was 3 different presidential candidates in 2016. And then she was making connections to Trump campaign officials during the campaign, which frankly blows my mind that this all could happen for a long period of time, because Bettina didn't do this for a year. She did it for like 5 years.
Yeah. She was at it for a long time.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, there was Paul Manafort, who also had deep Russian connections. And in the end, the U.S. government concluded that Manafort was giving U.S. internal polling data from the Trump campaign to the Russians, or I should say to Russian intelligence, while the Russian government was effectively interfering in the election.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all that. So, Chad, where can listeners find out more about you and your book?
You can find me personally in my author's website on chadlewis.net. You can find me on Substack at Peel the World. And you could find my book, The Persuasion Game, on Amazon Books and Barnes & Noble online.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all your time today. It's been a really great and detailed chat. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.